Yeah, hi, this is Mike Swanson. I'm with Skarica, and we were doing a lot of travel. We left New Orleans, went up to San Francisco. We actually went to a Raiders game yesterday.
It's a lot of fun, yeah.
And now we're in Napa Valley. We're going to visit some guy that runs a financial website.
Yeah.
And anyway, I thought I'd like to take a break from the traveling and talk about your book a little bit more, especially now because we've got the election coming out. And people, have been talking about that nonstop on American television, and the results will be coming out, pretty soon. And there's been lots of excitement. People saying that if the Republicans win, they may stop raising taxes,
or cut spending,
and doing this and that. And they think that's going to help the stock market. The market has been going up into the election. So what do you think about that?
I kind of talk about in the book, and we hinted on this briefly in our first video, that a lot of these things are major macro cycles, these debt cycles of empires and superpowers, where usually the country starts off small, kind of frugal, and then becomes an economic giant, and then expands its power, and then overexpands, and the government becomes too big and kind of implodes on itself. So my feeling is that it's like both the Republicans and Democrats are both responsible for this, and I don't really think much is going to change either way. I think that what's happened with the Democrats is I think Obama had a bunch of Keynesians around him, right? In terms of they thought that what turned the country out of the Great Depression was Roosevelt spending all this money, and they thought that they were going to do the same thing, and that the economy was going to boom, unemployment was going to go down, and all this stuff, right? It's that thing where you say you spend money, and then you create jobs, and then those people have to hire more people. But what's happened is the stock market's gone up, and maybe the actual technical indicators of the economy are still growing since the crash, but you really haven't had any job creation. And they're kind of dumbfounded and don't know what to do, because they thought the stimulus and all this sort of thing was going to be the end-all, be-all. So I don't think there's going to be much of a change as you shift back to the Republicans. Because I think the real thing is there has to be a real commitment to shrinking the size of government, to shrink that debt, and probably some kind of value-added tax or something like that has to be introduced, because you have lost a lot of that income tax revenue permanently here in the United States after the housing bubble blew up. So you have to shrink that budget deficit gap, and the problem I see is the Republicans are going to be dead against, cutting any sort of taxes, raising any sort of taxes, and the Democrats are going to be against cutting spending, and I think you're going to have this real standoff on it, and everyone's going to look at the election in 2012, and only no one really is going to want to go into that election, especially because we do have a recovery, and say, oh, I was the guy that cut spending, blah, blah, blah. Like maybe once they get into power in 2012, they'll have to do it. But this thing's now for the next 2 years, I don't see a big change in the financial situation.
Well,
and it's part of the long-term cycle. I just think that the U.S. is going towards bankruptcy like Britain did after World War II. And I just don't see, I think it's just too far right now. I don't see how that can be stopped.
Well, that's basically in your book, in the first chapter, that's kind of what you lay out, that these things the government has done with, the debt problem growing and growing is basically what you talk about in the first chapter. And you compare it to England and some other countries, and you lay out what happened there. And one thing about that is a lot of people that talk about these problems, first of all, I guess on the internet, the newsletter, the gold bug community, lots of people do talk about this stuff. But the only politicians that really do are like Ron Paul and some, libertarian, I guess, types. But, mainstream politicians don't really talk about this at all.
No.
So I think that's one thing about your book is, a lot of mainstream investors are going to be reading this and probably learning about that stuff for the first time.
And one of the theses about the book within the long-term cycle is one reason that we're entering this kind of blow-off phase. Blow-off is going to take 5 to 7 years in the commodity cycle or inflation cycle, is the double debt problem, is that the next bubble, I think, we had a bubble in tech, we had a bubble in housing, and the bubble in housing was kind of the consumer debt bubble, and then the next bubble is the government debt bubble, where all the leverage in the economies move from the consumer to the government. And I show a chart as the debt as a percentage of GDP in there. And what I show is the last debt bubble was during World War II when they had to spend all the war. Then that bubble was like the parabolic curve that collapsed. And that was because of the war. Well, now we're starting the same kind of parabolic curve in the government debt bubble. And at some point that's going to unwind itself. But just where does it go? Like right now, by the end of next year, we'll be at 110% of GDP at all levels of government, state, local, and federal combined. And the question is, where does that explode? Is it 150? Is it 200? If you include all the unfunded liabilities, it's even higher than that 110, right? So that is the thesis behind everything, is that because of this government debt bubble, we're going to see the continuing long-term cycles of the devaluation of the dollar, the money printing, of higher commodity prices, all of that sort of thing. And then the book talks about how to prosper from that. And we're going to do more videos later on commodities and emerging markets and things like that to kind of talk about that. But this book gives a nice kind of macro view of everything that I kind of believe. And in terms of the election, like I said, I don't think it matters. Like we were just joking before that I'm a big Raider fan, and they've stunk the last 7 years, and they've blown teams out the last 2 games. So right now, I'm more excited about the Raiders than I am about the Republicans taking over the House.
Well, I mean, they have, most of the people watching this, they like either the Democrats or Republicans. They're going to go vote and so forth. But when it comes to these big debt issues, neither party really
I don't think
has
anyone
any
really wants to
solution
take
at all.
It's kind of like you can do it 2 ways. You can be very proactive, like the British have done, or reactive, like the Greeks have done, because they had a debt crisis. Or you can kind of be like the Japanese. See, this is the problem. The low interest rates are supporting reckless behavior by the government, because as long as that interest expenditure doesn't eat into 20, 30, 40% of your revenues, you can operate the way they're operating. Like that's the thing Japan's been able to do. Like their government debt to GDP is well over 150 and close to 200%. Because their debt is all domestically owned, they've been able to keep interest rates under 2%, close to 1% for the last 20 years. So they've been able to support that. But of course, by not deleveraging the government, they're just stagnating the economy. So longer term. So that's the problem right now. Is if interest rates don't see a spike, yeah, they can still run $1 trillion deficits for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So it supports doing nothing, and cuts are hard. And people don't really want it. Like I said, going to the presidential election in 2012, I think in the next 2 years, no one really wants to deal with it. Like the advantage that the British government had is, and supposedly the Labour Party, even they were responsible for what happened in Britain, was going to do similar cuts as soon as they got elected. Because you're 3 or 4 years away from the election, so you get the cuts out ready early, and then you can hopefully say, oh, the economy stabilized because we did this. But the problem is, no one now wants to start doing cuts in 2011 or 2012. Because then you're going to election where you can say, oh, whatever you want about what you're going to spend on in 2012, but I think both parties are going to realize that we're going to have to really start cutting back probably at that time. And I think, again, which puts an underlying pinning to my argument of lower dollar, higher commodity prices, is everyone else around the world, in the Western world, has started hysteria. All of Europe is starting to cut spending, and the U.S. isn't even close to that. So my opinion is the dollar's really going to tank in a year or two when people say, well, look at the UK's debt to GDP, or deficit, sorry, is down to 4 or 5% from 10%. The Greeks are down, everyone's down, they've been cutting. You guys are still at 9 or 10%. And I think that's when you can see the dollar maybe break the lows of 2008 and that sort of thing.
Well, with that, and these debt problems, a lot of people talk about these sort of things, really make like a nightmare scenario of what could happen, but in the book you kind of don't do that. You kind of shy away from, or you don't agree with those type of real doom and gloom people, and you kind of have a different outlook.
Well, my outlook is, if you look at the past superpower that declined, the U.S. is not really similar to, say, an Argentinian bankruptcy or Spanish or the Romans. It's actually probably most similar to the UK. And the UK, if you look at the UK, has democratic values and a capitalistic system. Has strong property rights, all these sort of things. And the UK lost their empire, but they're still in the top about 20, 25 countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita. It's still a rich first world country. London is still a major financial center, and you go to London, it's nicer than a lot of cities, almost anywhere in the world, right? So my argument is, if they can kind of do what the UK's done, And like you said, then when the crisis comes, shrink everything. You know, the U.S. can still be a stable economy, and in a lot of ways, it will help the U.S. focus back on what the country's supposed to be about, which is strong individual rights, smaller government. You know, that's where the bankruptcy. It's going to hurt in 5 or 10 years, but maybe over a 20 to 30-year period can really help. Like, probably the coolest city in the world to live in the 60s, and this was just 15 years after the empire blew up, was UK. Like, the UK had the best music scene in the world in the
London,
60s.
right?
In London, yeah. Like, you know, the Beatles, the Stones, blah, blah, blah. You know, London, or just, you know, UK in general. And it was, you know, the economy really grew in the 60s as well. So it's like, it's not the end of the world, but there's going to have to be pain to do it. I actually think in the long run it's better, but in the short term, getting there is going to be very, 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 very difficult.
And that's what we'll talk about next time, this, you know, type of transition period and how that's going to create more inflation and so forth, and how people, you know, what they can do to specifically profit from that.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to talk about in the next 2 videos.
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about commodities and gold and, you know, things that, and then we'll talk about emerging markets in the next 2 videos and kind of show you, you know, hopefully how to make money from this coming debt bubble.
And of course you can find out about all in even greater detail by reading
the book. Yeah, and you can email Mike and I. It's available through, like, November 9th is the release date, so there'll be in all the bookstores then, or you can buy it on Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, all that sort of thing. And I guess the last thing I'd like to point out here, we're in Napa Valley right now, and this is one of the coolest. I've stayed in a lot of places, but this is a very cool resort. It's called the Gaia Napa Valley Hotel. It's like an environmental hotel, and they have like a heated pool and jacuzzi, all that sort of thing. But we're kind of surrounded by this mini man-made river, and they have geese and all kinds of animals swimming in this little river. We saw a few coming in. I don't know if you ever see now, but this little man-made lake river here. It's very, very swamp. It's very, very cool.
And the one funny thing about it, the rooms are really big. It was only like $80 a night.
Yeah, that was that was what drew me to it. And actually,
and there's
Napa,
no one here.
Everything in Napa tends to be quite expensive, so this is quite nice, you know. So I'm actually going to take a little, and this is heated too, so I'm going to take a little dip. That's nice. I'm going to take a little dip in it later.
So, well, anyway, we'll do another video for these people in a little bit.
Yeah, see you later. This is just a spa. I just want to see where the gym is.
Oh, sorry.
So it's in that building directly over here.
Yeah.
Follow this path. It leads you directly to the 2 double doors like this, but they're green, and you'll need your key to enter.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
There's nothing to put the camera on. If you turn these chairs around and all this would have been in the background. Look at Swan. Beautiful. Fantastic. Yeah, the margin is flat.
Most of the drugs that exist have tremendous side effects.
He's real excited about the Fed, ain't he?
Victor?
No, Kramer.
Oh.
He can't wait for it. He can't wait for the money printing.
Prophylaxis.
He loves it.
Once you have it,
They're bailing his ass out.
you'll have 0 days unless you're very fortunate.
You wanna go?